Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a great turnout. We're always happy to see this many people in person here at the Free Market Foundation. For those of you who do not know me, I am Martin van Staden. I am the head of policy here at the FMF, and it is my honor to be doing the introductions today. The FMF holds these monthly evening events in many ways as a kind of a community building exercise. We do not always agree with the speakers that we have up here, but we know that what they have to share will always be of interest to our supporters and our followers. Ultimately, we know that these events, even if the content is quite despondent, as is unfortunately often the case, makes everyone who attends in person or online more informed actors in South Africa's and the international social discourse. And this is very important to us, especially given that we are very involved in the so-called battle of ideas to bring about positive change in favor of freedom. Anthea Jeffery, who is also our speaker this evening. Dr. Jeffery is perhaps the most insightful and important analyst of the South African policy environment around today. And this insight is always manifested in the, in my view, magisterial content of her books. Dr. Jeffery honors the Free Market Foundation tonight by introducing her newest book, which I am holding up now, Countdown to Socialism, the National Democratic Revolution in South Africa since 1994. Which I must say I had the personal privilege of reading while it was still in draft form. So thank you for that, Anthea. I am very honored to have been included in the process. Now, this crowd will likely not be too taken aback by the title of this book, this very provocative title, whereas people outside this room might be like, oh, socialism, what are you talking about? But Dr. Jeffery has stood on this stage before, amongst many others, warning against the dangers of the current government's socialist enterprise. But the FMF, after all, was founded in 1975, all the way back then, in response to what was called creeping socialism, inherent in the policies of the government of those days. Andreas Wassenaar, who was the chairman of Sanlam, and a close associate of the foundation, wrote in 1977 about the Nationalist Party's government's assault on private enterprise and what he called the freeway to communism that it has set us on. And this was in 1977. As back then, socialism today, as we see it in the form of the ANC and the SACP's National Democratic Revolution, represents an existential threat to freedom and prosperity in this country, just as it did all the way back then. And I think we all look forward to Dr. Jeffery telling us all about it tonight. But before I hand over, just 3 small items of housekeeping. The first and most exciting is that Dr. Jeffery's book is being sold here tonight by Exclusive Books. So after the talk and after the questions, please feel free to grab a copy, and I believe Dr. Jeffery is kindly going to be available to sign your copy of the book. I'm also going to ask you to please hold your questions until after Dr. Jeffery has finished her remarks. And then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, which our CEO, David and Sarah, will be moderating. And then finally, yes, I'm going to ask you to please place your phones on vibrate or silent, just as a courtesy to the speaker and to the fellow guests. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthea Jeffery to the podium.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, Martin. And many thanks to the Free Market Foundation for Exclusive Books for coming here to make books available tonight. And very much to all of you for coming here and participating in this evening. I appreciate it enormously. And my topic, as Martin indicated, is indeed the countdown to socialism, the National Democratic Revolution, and these are the things that I would like to deal with. We'll start by looking at the fact that socialism is still the goal, which was very surprising to many people, that is to be achieved by means of the National Democratic Revolution, or the NDR. But the NDR, of course, been going on for quite a while, since 1994, which means that there are NDR achievements which have been notched up in the political arena. As part of that process, the Constitution has in some instances been reinterpreted to suit the NDR. And this has led to further NDR achievements in the socio-economic arena. And we also have many NDR interventions still to come, perhaps most serious of them at all. And finally, I'd like to look at the lessons from Venezuela and what South Africa can learn from its 20th century socialism. So let's begin by noting that socialism is indeed still the goal. And this will surprise very many people because of the disbandment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1991 and the disbandment of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Many people thought then that communism, socialism rather, had been so discredited that it could never rise again. But there were many left-leaning analysts, there were many socialist parties still in the other countries in the world who saw it quite differently, who looked at what had happened in the Soviet Union and said, well, it doesn't really matter, because in the words of Joe Slovo, what Moscow had done was too commandist and bureaucratic, and that isn't what socialism was supposed to be. In the future, socialism would be what it's supposed to be. It would be democratic, it would be participatory. And so everything that had gone wrong in the Soviet Union and other countries was irrelevant. We would have real socialism in the future. And real socialism is supposedly all about human rights. And so we had here in South Africa Chris Hani, who was then the General Secretary of the SACP, saying that socialism's all about decent shelter for the homeless, and it's about water for those who don't have safe water to drink, and health care, and a life of dignity for the aged, and decent schooling for all our people. And socialists make it seem that the only way to achieve these benefits is via socialism, which of course is also not true. But fundamentally, this is not an accurate description of socialism, because ultimately the reality is pervasive repression, unprecedented state power at a level which I think is difficult to imagine when you're in a still mainly capitalist country, and almost 100 million deaths that were chalked up in the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Cambodia, Vietnam, Cuba, and so on, and which were recorded in the Black Book of Communism in 1999. And all of this can't simply be waved away. In addition, democratic socialism has not worked in the 21st century, whether in Zimbabwe or in Venezuela. So socialism is to be achieved by means of the National Democratic Revolution. And what is it? The NDR concept was developed in the 1950s by the Soviet Union, and the aim was very much to take a whole number of newly independent colonies in Africa and Asia from capitalism to socialism by incremental steps. In some instances, it could be done quite quickly. At other times, it would require quite a prolonged process. The ANC and the SACP, which is the dominant partner of the ANC, have been committed to the NDR since the 1960s. I think at that point they often hoped that after liberation in South Africa, there would be a quick transition to socialism. But by the time the People's War ended in 1994 and the ANC took power, well, the Soviet Union had been disbanded and we were in what seemed to be a different global order, which meant that it was actually going to take a long time. Nevertheless, the SACP and the ANC still see the NDR as providing the most direct route to socialism, even though it may take 30 or 40 years to achieve that goal. And of course, they have already been implementing it since 1994, so progress has been made. And we'll start with NDR achievements in the political arena, which was where the focus was first placed. And among other things, Parliament has been greatly weakened because ANC MPs are deployed cadres, who therefore report to the deployment committees that put them in their positions rather than to voters. They don't hold the executive to account. They fail to do so, with Zuma over Nkandla and over state capture. They've more recently failed to do so with Ramaphosa and the Pala Pala saga. And overall, they are probably still too sleepist to act. This is a word that was coined by the Speaker of the National Assembly, Thandi Modise, who rather apologized to the Zondo Commission and said, sorry, I guess we were too sleepist. We could have stopped state capture, but we somehow didn't. And he was very skeptical about whether they would be any less sleepist in the future, as we heard when he addressed Parliament recently. The judiciary has been weakened. Not in all instances. There's some good judgments which come out of the Constitutional Court. But in very many cases, when it's important to the NDR, the judges are more committed to transformation, which is not a term that appears anywhere in the Constitution, than they are to upholding the actual wording in the Constitution. And other independent institutions have been greatly weakened by cadre deployment, which is a particularly important tool of the NDR. And James Myburgh was perceptive enough to say a number of years ago that cadre deployment creates two lines of accountability which conflict. The one line is ostensibly to the Constitution and the law, and so people who have been appointed to important institutions are supposed to be loyal to the Constitution. But actually they are cadres, so their first loyalty is really to the SACP, ANC deployment committees that have put them in their positions and which they need to keep pleasing in order to stay there. The media, the universities, civil society, business have all been infiltrated too. As the ANC wrote in its 1998 document on the strategy of cadre deployment, the aim was very much to use it in relation to civil society as well. And nothing seemed to be off limits to the ANC, which was what Bill Johnson wrote at the time. So they planned to deploy cadres to business and the economy. They had planned also to deploy them to education, to sports bodies, to science and technology institutions, to NGOs, perhaps to the churches. There really didn't seem to be any limit to how far cadre deployment could go. And in all instances, cadres would be expected to keep pushing for NDR implementation in whatever institutions they were in, to keep engaging in a battle of ideas that would make NDR concepts the right ones, and to report back to the ANC on what they observed in the institutions to which they had been deployed. The Constitution has also been reinterpreted to suit the NDR, and I can't give many examples of this, but perhaps just look at one in particular, and that is non-racialism. It's identified as a founding value of the new order, and yet constantly it is betrayed by racial quotas in employment, procurement, equity ownership, and elsewhere. And employment equity, or EE and BEE, are nevertheless bait-and-switch policies, to cite Thomas Sowell. What he says is they use the plight of the poor to implement policies that then benefit the relative elite. And that is true in America, and it is certainly true in South Africa, where perhaps 15% of black South Africans have benefited from these policies, and the remaining 85% have not benefited. Worse still, they've very often been harmed, because the appointment of unskilled people, the way in which preferential procurement works, means that state resources are not well used, and the poor people that rely on the state are shortchanged all the time. In addition, EE and BEE contradict another clause in the Constitution. This is Section 195, which requires broad representativity in the public service. Well, the first thing is that broad representativity is very different from the very rigid arithmetical quotas that are expected to be upheld. And whereas Section 95 talks also about the need for fairness and objectivity and ability and efficiency, all of those other factors are also forgotten. But critically, Section 195 talks only about broad representativity in the public service. So it doesn't apply in SOEs such as Eskom, which has been so diligent in trying to push out many of the experienced engineers in its employ because of racial quota imperatives. And it certainly doesn't apply in the private sector, something which the government is not willing to acknowledge when it passes a law such as the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Then there's another section in the Constitution which deals with procurement, and that's being effectively flouted as well, because Section 217 of the Constitution says that all organs of state must always procure goods and services in a way that is cost-effective, efficient, competitive, that, as Zondo put it, provides value for money. And that's an absolute obligation. But then the section also goes on to state that this does not prevent organs of state from applying preferences if these will advance the disadvantaged. But that wording is not mandatory, it's permissive at best. And yet the government is interpreting it as if all organs of state were obliged to implement these preferences. It's certainly not true for the private sector. And yet again, we see BEE requirements constantly disregarding this. Excuse me. And with the help of this sort of informally amended constitution, we have many NDR achievements in the socio-economic arena as well. And I'd start to look at some of the ones that were introduced under Zuma, who we all have been taught to believe is our radical economic transformation leader. And under him there was, for example, an amendment to labour law that introduced major constraints on casual and temporary labour. And many employers had found it preferable to employ people on a temporary basis, because if you employed them on a permanent basis, they were subject to such strict rules on salaries, benefits, retrenchments, terminations, and so on. And so casual employment was really the only part of the labour market that was growing strongly. Cosatu claimed that this was entirely illegitimate and that people being employed by labour brokers were effectively being used as slave labour, and the law was passed, which does not completely prohibit casual labour, but it does constrain it effectively to a period of 3 months. So the effect was to choke off an important avenue for first-time work seekers to get their foot on the ladder, the jobs ladder, and secondly, to just make it more difficult to generate the jobs that we so badly need. Then BEE rules were tightened up, particularly, say, in the preferential procurement area, and there were harsher penalties. And a new offence of fronting was introduced, which was very broadly defined, and now directors could be sent to jail for up to 10 years for fronting. And if the company was involved, then there could be a fine of up to 10% of annual turnover, also for the offence of fronting, as very broadly defined. But 10% of annual turnover is an extraordinary amount. Many businesses don't make a profit of that amount, of that proportion. So they are being set up to be pushed into bankruptcy for failure to do what the government wants on BEE. Employment equity rules were also tightened up. There were fewer defences available to business on which they could rely, and again, bigger fines, with the possibility at the end of the day for repeat offences that a firm might be fined 10% of annual turnover for failing to make reasonable progress towards demographic representativity when the skills shortage, among other things, makes that so difficult to attain. And the entire idea of a norm of demographic representativity is not accurate. It's not found in any society, despite great efforts to locate it. If we look at other NDR achievements under Zuma, the land claims were reopened, so we had 160,000 more restitution claims that were lodged before the relevant statute reopening the process was struck down. And that's really an important thing, because this was twice the number that had initially been lodged. Many of those initial 80,000 claims still hadn't been settled. Now you had 160,000 claims which can't be looked at yet. The initial ones first have to be resolved. But it will take hundreds of years and at least 100 billion rand to deal with these restitution claims. So the real point of them is for the ANC to be able to argue that the simplest solution is to have major expropriation without compensation, and then the state will decide how land should be reallocated. We also had bilateral investment treaties with Western countries that were terminated. These were with all our most important investor partners: the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, France. The countries which invest the most in South Africa had their bilateral investment treaties ended. Countries like Russia, Cuba, and China did not. And the upshot is that where a fresh investment comes from the European states, then it can be made subject to EWC. The Expropriation Bill of 2015 was adopted by Parliament but not signed into law. The SACP said, we think we can get more. In other words, they wanted an EWC provision to be included in the Expropriation Bill, and that's what we have now in the version that is before Parliament. Harney's vision of socialism as all about socioeconomic rights was also brought closer. First of all, these rights were included in the 1996 Constitution, mostly as rights of access to health care, water, food, social security. And at the same time, the Bill of Rights was given both a vertical and a horizontal application. In appropriate circumstances, and it wasn't clear what those were, it would be binding not only on the state, but also on the private sector, even though the latter has no tax revenues with which it can help fulfill guaranteed rights. So whether horizontal application was to extend to the socioeconomic rights was a little uncertain, at least in the beginning, but now I think it's become increasingly clear, at least in the context of healthcare, that the ANC does see the right to healthcare as being binding on business, and this is part of the rationale for the NHI demand, that private hospitals, for example, must treat patients for free and then reclaim from the NHI fund in the amount that the state is willing to sanction, because prices will be set by the state. The fees that surgeons and doctors can charge will be decided by the NHI fund, and at the end of the day, these could be too low to cover reasonable costs, and private hospitals could find themselves being pushed towards bankruptcy. Then, very important goal for the NDR is to de-link people from the capitalist economy. And one of the ways that you do that is by getting the state to provide a whole lot of goods and services. So we have had the state for many years providing free RDP housing, free basic water and electricity, mostly free schooling and university education and healthcare, and by 2018, some 17.5 million social grants which were being paid out in cash every month. So this was an extraordinary effort, obviously very helpful to the poor, but also building a dependency on the state and the idea that it's the state that should provide these things and not the competitive, innovative private sector. Under Ramaphosa, our new dawn reformist president, there has been a whole slew of interventions of an NDR kind, too many to list here. So many, in fact, that one could see Ramaphosa as the most successful RET president rather than Zuma. But the National Minimum Wage Act is particularly important, so let's look at that quickly. What it has meant is that poorly skilled and inexperienced youth are being priced out of jobs. And that's partly because the national minimum wage was set at quite a high level when it began. And since then, it's gone up very fast. It's gone up 20% in general, and for some groups, such as domestic servants, where it started out lower, it's gone up by 70% in 4 years. So that's an extraordinary increase, and I think it's not surprising that many domestic servants' jobs are now unfortunately being lost. Employers effectively incur a loss in hiring those who have poor schooling, no experience, no on-the-job knowledge, and Ramaphosa is well aware of this. It's his wording that he says that employers incur a loss, and so they have no reason to employ the people who don't have experience. So youth unemployment through this and many other labour interventions is being pushed up, and as we now know, the official rate exceeds 60%, and the expanded rate, where you take into account those too discouraged to keep looking for jobs, it exceeds 70%. And this, of course, from the NDR perspective, adds to revolutionary potential. It creates instability. It also creates a demand for permanent public employment programs. The idea is that we shouldn't just have temporary job opportunities as have had for many years in the expanded public works program. Rather, the aim now is for 2 million permanent public jobs by 2030 at a cost of 100 billion, which is yet another thing that the fiscus simply cannot afford, with public debt already so high. Again, though, this will help to de-link people from the capitalist economy. If they don't need to rely on it for jobs and income, This is a very important step forward. But it will also, of course, remove autonomy and the possibility of self-reliance and build yet more dependence on the state. If we look at some of the NDR interventions still to come, and these are even more serious than the ones we've had already, there's the Expropriation Bill of 2020, very much the same as the 2015 one that wasn't taken forward, but with the key difference now that you can get nil compensation in many instances, and, as before, inadequate compensation in almost every other case. Compensation will often be less than the amount of mortgage debt which is outstanding, and that raises all sorts of other questions, because though the mortgage itself will come to an end when the state takes ownership so that the bank can't foreclose on the property now owned by the government, the underlying debt doesn't come to an end, and the expropriated owner is still expected to pay it. But having lost a key asset, he or she may not be able to do so. So there's a real risk of defaults and of property values going down, and perhaps even of a banking crisis, as the Banking Association of South Africa has tried repeatedly to warn the government. There's also a possibility that once we have the expropriation bill in place, we'll see other legislation being introduced, which will give the state custodianship, say, of agricultural land or of certain land. The 2014 bill that I refer to there did propose to give the state custodianship of all agricultural land. In the end, that bill didn't proceed, but it could be revived and brought back in the future. The 2021 Constitutional Amendment Bill, people may recall, proposed to give the state custodianship of certain land. What certain land means is, of course, highly uncertain, but it's certainly possible that it could include, say, all privately owned land. We simply don't know. And there would be no compensation payable on the taking of custodianship of land, which of course is what happened in 1998 when water resources were vested in the custodianship of the state. The same thing happened in 2004 when mineral resources beneath the ground were vested in the custodianship of the state. And the ANC was very pleased when in 2013 the Constitutional Court in the Agri-SA case said that this was all fine. You didn't have to pay compensation because the taking of custodianship was effectively a deprivation, not an expropriation, and there is a right to compensation only when you're dealing with an expropriation. The case, fortunately, is very badly argued. It's very weak. I think it can be contested. I think it's an example of how the Constitution's meaning has quietly been changed, but the words are still the same, and one hopes one can rely on them. And then what we also have coming is what I think the first one we're still quite well aware of. Let me just go back, which is the NHI. The NHI bill has already gone through the National Assembly. It's before the National Council of Provinces. It will put an end to all medical schemes. It will create a single state-run medical aid, the NHI fund, which even COSATU at times sounds worried about. It will give the state control of all health services, the fees to be paid, the medicines to be provided, the treatments to be made available, and it will lead to the state rationing health services. There won't be enough, so the state effectively will decide what illnesses, in what circumstances, are to be treated. Then we have what people are much less aware of, a similar proposal coming up through in terms of the National Social Security Fund. This is still just at the green paper stage, and the last time it was published by the minister, it was withdrawn in the face of a general outcry. But it's absolutely crucial to the ANC, and so I think it's likely to come back. And it would result in a single, probably state-run pension system, with private pension schemes no longer being allowed to operate, like medical schemes will not be allowed to. State control of all pension savings, which currently amount to more than 6 trillion, and all pension contributions as they are made in the future. And again, a state rationing of pension payouts. There won't be enough. The emphasis will be on equality, and the ANC thinks it more important that the money that will be in that fund should first be used to pay disability and survivor benefits, where people die at work. Then and they don't have life insurance, it's this fund that will provide the money to their dependents. So there will be much less available for pensions than perhaps people think. So then there's also the basic income grant, which is to be funded probably by a wealth tax, though we don't know. A basic income grant would probably be introduced at the lower food poverty level. According to the Centre for Development and Enterprise, it would cost 280 billion a year at the start. If it's taken up to the upper food poverty level, it would cost 600 billion a year. And again, that's money that we simply don't have in the kitty and we can't easily afford to borrow. So the idea is that it might be funded by a wealth tax. And this is a tax which is levied on the ownership of all assets, from homes probably to pension savings and various other things. Very few countries levy a wealth tax because they are difficult to administer and they tend to yield rather little. But the government has great hopes that our wealth tax will yield a great deal and will also help to reduce inequality. Then the South African Reserve Bank and the National Treasury are to be brought into line. The SACP in particular is almost apoplectic against them at the moment because they are in thrall to neoliberalism and austerity. The austerity is difficult to see given the way public spending has been going on. The neoliberalism is also, again, a little difficult to see against the face of the NDR and all its interventions. But for Saab, the idea seems to be that instead of hiking interest rates, they should rather do things like, well, rather the government as a whole, because the Saab can't do that, like increasing taxes and also imposing price controls. For the Treasury, it's constantly being told that it must stop talking about the need to, sort of weigh one need against another, that all needs can be met, particularly if you print money in the way that modern monetary theorists think you can. And so it shouldn't be standing in the way of the NHI or the basic income grant, or the idea of public employment for all, or the idea of the state pension system. And overall, particularly in relation to the big, there's increasingly now also an undercurrent message that if we don't get a basic income grant soon, then we can expect a rerun of the dreadful July 2021 riots. Public spending and public debt have in fact been rising very rapidly since 2009. Our ratio of public debt to GDP already exceeds 70% and looks set to go up higher quite fast because we're simply not bringing down public spending as fast as we should be. But all of this is in line with the Cloward-Piven strategy, if I pronounce that correctly. This was developed in the United States in the 1960s by two left-leaning academics at Columbia University in New York, who said what you need to do is burden the state with a whole number of incredibly costly, in fact impossible to meet burdens, because in the end you will bankrupt the state, and that will help to cripple the capitalist economy, create such a crisis that you can then push for your socialist alternative. So let's end with looking at the lessons from Venezuela and its 21st century socialism. And the first point I want to talk about is this. Commentators in Venezuela have said after the event that they didn't take the threat seriously enough. That when Hugo Chavez came in and started to talk about 21st century socialism and nationalization and various other ways to expand state power and control, many of them didn't believe that it would happen. They thought Venezuela was such a wealthy country, it had a well-developed economy, it had a strong middle class, resilient democracy. And after the disaster had struck, they said, we didn't think it could happen to us. And their message to South Africa is, don't believe that it can't happen to you. So what did happen, very much in a nutshell, the state oil company was packed with incompetent and corrupt cadres, which crippled its capacity, of course, rather like Eskom. And as I recently read, it's now rather being rescued by a Russian company instead, which may also lie in store for us. Expropriation, often for no compensation, was implemented for farming land. About 20% of the farming land was taken. Many houses, also mines, banks, various sectors. And as the supply of goods began to dry up, so price controls were introduced, but that of course just pushed more businesses into bankruptcy. You also had collapsing infrastructure, particularly water and electricity, which sounds horribly familiar. And then you had hyperinflation, which just decimated people's earnings and their savings. The situation you have now is that 80% of people live in poverty in what had been a very wealthy country. Hunger has become widespread. 7 million people out of a population of 30 million have fled, making it one of the greatest displacement crises in the world. GDP has shrunk by 70% in the last 10 years, which is a staggering statistic. There's been major political repression, great efforts on the part of the opposition to push out the ruling party, to embark on reform, but even where the opposition won a 2/3 majority in 2015, it didn't help, because Parliament was effectively bypassed and the Supreme Court was packed with people who upheld what the President wanted. And at the same time, we have massive inequality between most of the population suffering enormously and a small political elite. Hugo Chavez, who began it all, became one of the 400th wealthiest people in the world, according to Forbes, and his daughter is said to have assets worth $4 billion. So it seems rather ironic that critics of capitalism often talk about inequality as one of its bad outcomes, but inequality in socialism tends to be even more severe. And yet the ANC alliance repeatedly endorses Venezuela and is keen to follow it down the EWC path. So it brings me back to the book, Countdown to Socialism, because I hope that what it does is to explain why it is that we are doing so badly in South Africa, why policies are so bad, why corruption is so great, why dysfunctionality is so pervasive, and also why the ANC doesn't try to reform. All of this in many ways suits the ANC. If you're to move from capitalism to socialism, you certainly can't do it in the context of a thriving capitalist society. But if the capitalist system becomes rather crippled and is ineffective and can't provide jobs, then, of course, the argument to shift to socialism is so much stronger. So the ANC has an interest in crippling the capitalist economy and an interest in increasing poverty and instability as a background for the shift to socialism. And what is extraordinary, since the ANC and the SACP make no bones about their commitment to the NDR and that it's the most direct route to socialism, what is extraordinary is that so few South Africans know about the National Democratic Revolution. And this is clearly because the commentariat doesn't talk about it. In the memorable words of John Kane Berman, a former CEO of the IRR, the commentariat is sleeping through the revolution, and that means most South Africans are sleeping through it too. And I hope that through the book people will become less baffled, and that once they have been forewarned, they will be forearmed about ways to defeat the great damage that the NDR has already done and is likely to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthea. I thought that was a very good crystallization of many of the core themes of the book. And sometimes there's some hard truths in the book, and some of them are quite difficult to contemplate as we see how the NDR has advanced over our society and has crippled our economy. So we'll now have an opportunity to ask Anthea some questions. Just a few housekeeping rules before we do that. If you could please limit yourself to one question. If you could also introduce yourself, and please could we also avoid long speeches. Please consider your questions carefully and ask them crisply and succinctly to Anthea. And I see that there are already some hands. As is customary, Mark usually asks his question first. His hand was up first, and then we'll go to Pierre, but we'll take one question at a time. Oh, and finally, if you could also use this microphone and introduce yourself so that our viewers around the world can also hear your question.
My name is Mark Oppenheimer of the Johannesburg Bar. Anthea, thank you for an excellent presentation. You point out that the path the ANC has followed is perfectly within their personal interests, that it is to the detriment of all South Africans, rich and poor alike, but the ANC have profiteered off of their policies. They've become incredibly rich, like Chavez's daughter. Given that, what are the best ways of pushing back against the NDR? Given that the ANC officials have a strong interest in continuing down the path that they're going, how do you change that incentive structure, and how do you get the rest of the country galvanized against a horrific policy?
Thanks, Mark. As always, a difficult question. I think that one of the arguments to make to the wider ANC cadreship is that the spoils are actually quite limited. The people at the very top will do very well, but increasingly people who are not at the very top will find that they're not doing well. And I think maybe one can piggyback on the sort of concern that COSATU did express when they realized that the NHI fund is going to be the sole medical aid for the entire country. And at the moment, you know, they have the GEMS system. It probably works a great deal better than the NHI fund will. And so there was a concern, and the COSATU leadership will try and suppress that and bring them back into line. But I think at the grassroots level, there's certainly concern about how these things are working out. Again, there may be much more information to be made available, ironically, right across the civil service. They've all been subjected, of course, to a great deal of propaganda in support of the NHI and other interventions. To have the other side of the story, what it will mean in practice, how they will suffer even though they are cadres, needs to be made clear. And then in terms of the wider ANC support base, I think the research that Bill Johnson did a number of years ago was actually fascinating in showing that the ANC support base is actually pretty moderate. They don't want this kind of thing. So it is really a very small group of people, the 4,000, 5,000 people that go to the ANC national conferences every 5 years, that adopt these radical policies, that recommit themselves to the NDR, even though most ANC voters would actually prefer to have business-friendly policies. And that's why there was a great deal of support for Ramaphosa, because of the hope that he would bring them in, and probably now a disappointment that he hasn't succeeded in doing that. I would say not because he ever intended to do business-friendly policies, but many people still have illusions on that score. But we have a number of cadres who don't understand just how bad it can be for them, and a number of ANC voters who don't support what the party is doing. And the other point is we need to remember the imbalance in the 2019 election, when there were 10 million people that voted for the ANC and 18 million people who could have voted, but didn't go to the polls at all. Either they didn't register, or having registered, they didn't pitch up to vote. But that 18 million is potentially an enormously important swing vote. And if enough people there can be persuaded to go out and vote for opposition parties that aren't sort of ANC-light options, then we could see real change.
Right, we have Pierre at the back there. Pierre, if you could introduce yourself.
Anthea and I have been friends with the book for a while, and when I saw the cover I was impressed, except I meant to ask her why it's a stopwatch and not an alarm clock. Apropos the NHI, I've read that the NHI is going to attempt to access the money that we, who are members of medical aids, voluntarily contribute every month to these medical aids. How do they intend to do this?
They intend to do it via taxation. So at the moment, just to take a round figure, if individuals are contributing, say, 250 billion rand a month to their medical aids for the private healthcare of their choice, they will instead find themselves facing tax increases of a similar magnitude. And this can be done through surcharges on personal income tax, the ANC has said, or perhaps by introducing a kind of poll tax. There's been some talk of VAT, but I think they would try to avoid that because that would cause a lot of resistance at the grassroots level. But what is also very serious, and I think people don't realize, is that they'll be told these are NHI taxes. This money is going to go into the NHI fund, and then it'll be available for you and for everyone for healthcare needs. But actually, under the Constitution, all revenue has to be paid into the General Revenue Fund and used for all general purposes, including public service wages and SOE bailouts, unless the National Treasury agrees that there should be specific legislation which will earmark revenue raised through these taxes specifically for the NHI fund. In the absence of that legislation, which the Treasury is very reluctant to push for or see adopted, the money that is raised through taxes will go into the general fund, and at the end of the day, it will unfortunately, one of the consequences will be to help grease the ANC patronage machine rather than be kept available for health. And there is experience of that in Canada, where the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank there, has tried to analyze how much of the so-called health taxes are actually used for a healthcare system that's similar to the NHI. It's a single-payer system. And they've come to the conclusion that a lot of it gets lost along the way and swept into other state needs.
My name is Shelley Lou. I'm a former public representative for the DA, a staff member for the DA and the DP and predecessors, and I have kind of semi-retired because I feel very tired. There's a question I've often asked my friends and colleagues over the years, and I've never really received a satisfactory answer, or an answer that satisfies me. It's around more the psyche of the few thousand, as you put it, in the ANC, who make these decisions and go hell for leather over these after these policies. And that is, why would they do it when they know full well from evidence across the world that they're killing the golden goose? Why would they do it? I don't understand why even the most rabid socialist wouldn't see the dangers and the fact that the well is going to run dry, and that the spectre of Zimbabwe and others, is there waiting for us like a ghost. So I don't understand that, and I thought, I would ask you, what do you think about the golden
difficult
goose
to understand,
and slitting its throat?
I think the answer does lie in the extraordinary power, the extraordinary wealth that accumulates to the very top political elite. In Zimbabwe, for example, when I did a launch in Cape Town last week, one of the photographs we showed was a picture of Mugabe's blue-roofed palace. It's an extraordinary structure. So he lived very high on the hog and went to Singapore for medical treatment, even as all the Zimbabweans were suffering so enormously and having to leave the country in millions. And the figures I gave about Venezuela, it's the same picture. The very top elite do extremely well, and everybody else suffers. But the people who are enjoying the power, the people who are enjoying the wealth, don't think very much about how everybody else is suffering. And I'm afraid that there may be a sense of shock in relation to the ANC, which many people think of as a highly moral organization, partly because the way in which it conducted the struggle against apartheid has really been soft-soaped. Most people don't understand that this was a ruthless people's war which was aimed primarily at killing their black opposition, and which was extremely successful in doing so. Most people see it more as a sort of civil rights campaign with a few bomber blasts going off primarily against military targets, sometimes going off in wimpy bombs, but that was in bars, that wasn't so important. If you begin to understand how ruthless the ANC is, then you also can begin to understand how callous they can be to the poor. And this has been written into their DNA for a very long time. As I said, they embraced the idea in the 1960s, the SACP first and then the ANC, when they were worried that they were losing to the black organizations coming up inside the country after the Soweto revolt, the black consciousness organizations, and in Carter, they went to Vietnam to learn how to wage that people's war and weaken their black rivals. And they adopted something called the Green Book, Lessons from Vietnam, in which they said, we're going to go from liberation to socialism, but we're not going to tell anybody about that yet, because that would limit the support that we can gain as we're waging the people's war. So it's always been there. And it's now that they feel that they can be more open about it. And I think part of the reason is that we've reached a point in the NDR implementation where you can't really hide it. But also there is support for socialism growing in many different countries of the world, particularly among the youth. It's more than 30 years since the Soviet Union imploded. The knowledge of those 100 million deaths, etc., has all faded. And it's not top of mind among young people who have probably never been given much exposure to the crimes of humanity, against humanity, that were committed in socialist countries. You know something about the Nazi death camps, but not about the Gulag, and not about the famines that killed 10 million people and so on. But around the world, there is now this increasing interest in socialism, an increasing sort of dissatisfaction, if not rejection, of capitalism. And so that also helps the ANC to say we're not out of sync, we're in keeping with a trend, and what we're planning to do will be terribly good for us at the very top.
Yeah, I think the sad irony is that the more that capital is disciplined and directed by the NDR, the more that the benefits of capitalism are actually diluted. And
Yeah.
then more people start to question, oh, where are the dividends from capitalism? We need something else. It's a sad irony. Yeah, I see Mike Brown in the back there, and then we'll go to Tony next, and then to Terry after that, but one by one. I want to go with Tony first.
Tony Hampson Tyndale with a cold. Thank you for your presentation. The main problem is that communism and socialism are just too good to share with the masses, and hence we get this parasitic government we have in South Africa. The ANC is not the greatest problem we have in South Africa. The greatest problem is people here and outside as well. It's voter apathy. Instead of demanding that we live a democracy rather than just talk about it. My question is, who is actually orchestrating this process? Because I seriously doubt the cerebral capability of the ANC to have put this all together. So it's presumably coming from outside, not improbably from liberalistic elements in the United States, but it's very difficult to understand who is actually controlling this process that we're heading towards, like the edge of a cliff. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think you're right to flag the voter apathy. You know, the figures I gave, 18 million people didn't go to the polls. Those are the people that we need to persuade to go out and vote. The bigger question of where does the ANC get these ideas from, I think you're quite right. It's not all homegrown. And that when the Soviet Union disbanded, there were, as I said, more than 100 socialist parties left in other countries of the world. Many left-leaning commentators, analysts, academics in many Western democracies who were probably took a step back for sure, but then regrouped and increasingly came to the conclusion, as I said, that socialism had just been wrongly applied, and what had happened that had gone wrong was irrelevant, because we were going to get to real socialism now, and real socialism would be democratic, participatory, geared towards human rights. I think that the Socialist International is an important part of the way in which plans are made. I think from a book that I read a little while ago, there have been big gatherings held in different parts of the world where left-leaning NGOs and analysts from many different countries get together to talk about strategies and plans. I think that in South Africa, the idea for horizontal application of the Bill of Rights was partially developed by left-leaning academics in the US. The idea that you should have transformationism in our interpretation of our Constitution also comes from the US. So there is this whole body of no doubt very clever people in many different countries who are working on a way of trying to weaken capitalism, if not directly in the way that the ANC is doing, but certainly to badmouth it, to give it a bad press, and who are succeeding to the point where I think a recent Edelman poll showed that in most countries of the world, a majority of people think that capitalism is more of a problem than a solution. So the ANC can tap into all of this and obtain guidance, as it did during the People's War period, where it got daily advice from Moscow, even after the Soviet Union had disbanded. Their old Moscow hands who'd worked with it for 30 years were still on hand to help guide it.
Mike Brown, say I'm a financial man, and we often look at things the other way around or upside down, which is obviously not the way academics tend to look at things. And to what extent, when you look at your clock, it's an hour to midnight, and this is the success of socialism, do you think it might be the other way around in South Africa? The NDR has been going for 30 years. The commanding heights of the economy is still in the hands of the private sector, the banking industry, the health industry, the pension fund industry. Is all operated fairly effectively by private sector money and private sector structures. So they always say socialism breaks down when you've got nothing more you can nationalise or seize. Now the state has tried to seize whatever it can, and it hasn't been particularly successful in certain aspects of it. And the private sector still survives to some extent. So could we say that maybe if they can't achieve success very quickly on some of these socialist ideals the ANC has, that we could be looking for the clock to start turning the other way around? That
I wish.
The private sector is now being asked to provide the assets and the services that the state can't provide. That's not what the politicians want, but on the ground that possibly is what happens. Because I think South Africa's had a long, and Venezuela was quite quick. A lot of these others have been quite quick. We had 30 years of this socialist revolution, and it hasn't achieved a lot, really, in terms of delivering to the people.
Yes, no, delivery to the people it certainly hasn't achieved. But I think the worst interventions, as I said, still lie ahead. I think that once we have the expropriation bill in place, the government, if it wants to, will be able to move fast, not only against land, but against a whole range of businesses, because it won't just be property is defined in the Constitution and in the expropriation bill as not limited to land. So we have insight into many of the propositions which lie before us, from expropriation to NHI to the National Social Security Fund and so on. I think the ANC has been going as fast as it feels it can. The first 10 years were a difficult period because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You needed time for the world socialist movement to revamp. And what you also want as part of the NDR is to take advantage of private sector resources. That's terribly important. So now that we've reached the point where Eskom really is crippled, it's fine to use the private sector resources provided they don't have control. And so you will increasingly hear ANC people saying, yes, we will, we're bringing in the private sector. We're not going to give them leadership. We're certainly not going to give them ownership or control. After a certain period, these assets are going to be ours. It's perhaps most notable in the deal that's being done with Transnet over the Durban port, where the Philippine company that is willing to make resources available is going to become a shareholder in a new entity. But in that new entity, Transnet will have a 51% stake, and the Philippine company will have a 49% one. So resources will flow from the company in order to improve the port and hopefully get it operating much faster. But after 25 years, all those assets will actually pass to the state, which will retain ownership and control all the way through. And I think what the ANC also specializes in is reassuring business. Say with the MPRDA, don't worry about us taking custodianship, because you're going to get new mining rights in place of your old mining rights. And there's the 26% HDSA ownership requirement for historically disadvantaged South Africans, but that's immutable. We'll never change it. And then after a while, it becomes a 30% requirement, as it is now for new mining rights. And in the agricultural sphere, the taking of trusteeship or custodianship was again accompanied by many reassurances, but nothing will immediately change. You'll still have the water use that you have now, and that it will continue. It just will be under the state's control, and there'll be reviews, and it can't last more than 40 years. But now suddenly we find a draft regulation that says that if you're going to use a large amount of water, then you must have 75% black ownership. So having been kind of cajoled, and I'm not criticizing the private sector here, I think it's an enormously difficult thing for directors to do. there's obviously an incentive to go along to get along and to hope that the promises will be upheld and that the degree of state control that you can see already will not be too damaging. But the stakes can always be changed. Yeah? I think Franz Cronier has said once you've given up the principle of your ownership of your business and they want 25%, well, when they come and say they want 50% or 70%, it's just detail.
Hi, Terry Markman speaking. Anthea, it seems to me that this is not so much a practical debate or argument, but an intellectual one. And for your book, which I haven't read yet, thank you for that, because I'm sure there's a lot of intellectual ammunition in that. So my first question is, to what extent do you think that this debate can be won, call it a debate, but this fight can be won by just the practical argument of saying that it's just impractical for the state to run things, or we have to bring in the intellectual moral argument? I mean, it seems to me that I'm not denying the practical argument and how inefficient the state is and so on. But if we don't at some stage talk about how evil the system is, that we want a moral system that is pro-freedom, pro-individual freedom, etc., pro all the precautions against state intervention. I mean, in a way, what the American original Constitution said. If we don't bring that in, I think that we're going to lose continuously. I mean, there is no way that you can defend capitalism other than on moral grounds. If you defend it on practical grounds, I'll just say, like you said with the Joe Slover. Oh, well, it didn't work there, but it'll work somewhere else. We've got to also tell the people that it's highly immoral. And I'm very worried, I don't know if you also, but the business people are not, as a rule, very small percentage are not as a rule intellectuals. I can recall in the early 90s having a discussion at the Chamber of Mines with some of the big mining companies, and they were going to go for a Bosperato or whatever it was, to talk to them, to talk to the Department of Mines, whatever it was called in those days. And they were busy negotiating the pros and cons of what the mining company, what the ANC was going to do. And in the end, they came back and very naively said, oh no, they reassured us that we would be safe, our properties be safe. And yet, in the end, they took it. And I remember looking at a few people and saying, can these guys be so naive? So I'm not sure that business is on our, not that they're not on our side, but they are going to be in the battle with us because they've got to, my question to you is, surely this is an intellectual battle as much as just a practical one.
Well, I think one must bring intellectual arguments, but one must also raise as many facts and warning elements as possible. And I think that what has happened over the years, if you stop and look on it, shows this constant encroachment of the ANC, where it says it's taking X and then it takes more. And it says it's working in this area, but then it goes to that one. And one can hope that business can now really see that this encroachment hasn't got an end that business would like. And also, I think there is now a certain disillusionment with the ANC. Of course, the vast corruption, the vast inefficiency, the vast incompetence all indicates that business resources are necessary. The risk is that business will feel so pleased about being able to help that it won't understand the NDR strategy of using business resources for the benefit of the revolution and sort of having swallowed them going forward with the revolution just the same. So it's vital that business should really wake up to the risk that it faces and see, I think, that this is not just in South Africa. Here it's the NDR. That's what suits our particular circumstances. In other countries, it takes other formats. For example, the emphasis on critical race theory in the US, where, again, you've got an oppressor group and a victim group, and the only way to end the victimization is for the victims to rise up and overturn the oppressor, which is a very Marxist sort of idea. And that's now being inculcated into the schools, which people are getting worried about. So to see that this is a kind of an octopus that spreads very far, potentially, and one must be able to act against it in every way, with the argument that capitalism works far better, with the argument that capitalism really helps people to get out of poverty. All the data that's been assembled through the Economic Freedom of the World reports over decades is extremely useful, one would think, in persuading people that capitalism has value, real value to the poor, because it helps them far more than socialism ever will. And this is a message that we must increasingly get out too. And in South Africa, we're actually pushing at an open door in terms of what ordinary people think, because they aren't imbued with radicalism. I think Bill Johnson was interested when he was asking questions more recently of the EFF. And he said, well, if you had a choice between getting a job and having an expropriated farm, EWC, they said, well, we'd like the job. And that's fortunate, because so long as we don't have a terribly radical populace pushing for the kinds of things that the ANC elite wants, then we can help to forge a moderate majority that is in tune with practical solutions for South Africa's problems.
Great. Well, I think we're nearing the end, so we'll take the last two questions, please. Yes, sir.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Meese, another clapped-out, old, disillusioned South African, noch toughing it out living in Hillbrow. My question is actually a very practical one, almost at a housewife, household hints level. I would like to know what the hell can ordinary, especially older people, which reflects most of this room, young people can still make a plan to go somewhere else or do something else, but let's say the middle-aged and older people, apart from voting for other than the ANC in the next election, which comes with its own set of problems, as I think any thinking person will know, what can an ordinary little person do at a practical level? I mean, I wonder if I shouldn't take all my savings, convert it into Kruger Rands, and put it under my mattress. What are your thoughts on very practical level things to do? I mean, should one buy 1 million boxes of Panados, so at least you'll be able to cure your headache? Okay, sorry, I know this sounds light-hearted and frivolous, but we've been talking in very theoretical, global terms, and I'm just looking for something a little bit more practical. What the hell can I do?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we should minimize the voting in the next election, because that really is the key. If the ANC and the EFF, well, even without the EFF, if the ANC continues down the path that we can now see illuminated before us, it will be disastrous. We then look at the Venezuelan issue much more closely. So we mustn't believe that it can't happen to us. And that's the first message that we need to set out to as many people as possible. So I think obviously the political parties have a big job to play here. And one would hope very much that the political parties will become worried about the future and will develop a very strong message for potential voters that they dare not risk the ANC staying in power and that they do have better policies. So we know that this national convention is to take place next month. Hopefully it will yield some sort of an agreement. What I also heard Zongezo Zibi saying of Rise Mzansi was a sensible thing. Every person should tell 10 people that they must go and vote. They must register and they must vote, and why. I mean, he wouldn't put it in NDR terms, but certainly the message every person must spread to their 10 friends and relations is an important one, because that might be a good way of getting people to see that you don't punish the ANC by staying away from the polls, which I think many people still have the illusion that you do, that it has to be that active step, going to register, going to vote for somewhere else, and it's not to be sneezed at. The other thing is that one will have to challenge laws which are already on the statute book, like the Employment Equity Amendment Act, laws which are coming. And the Constitution, as written, provides a powerful foundation on which to do that. The ANC has tried to reinterpret the Constitution with the help of some rather bad judges at times. So we can try to get back to the wording of the Constitution as it is written. And again, the more the judges themselves become worried about the consequences of transformation and getting away from the words of the Constitution, the more willing they might be to come back to what it says and start applying it. And litigation costs money, so not all the Krugerrands under your bed. Some of them into the coffers of the organizations that will go to court and will try to fight in that way, because that's very important too. One of the problems is that it's very hard to get your message out. The SABC is not going to carry it. The mainstream media is increasingly, either on the fence or very wary about talking about the NDRs. They have been for a long time. So what we've done at the IRR, we've started another newspaper. It comes out every day and it carries material that the mainstream media is reluctant to deal with. So in as many ways as possible, one must get the message out. So support organizations which are setting up these alternative channels of communication, which are vital, and which at the end of the day will have to litigate to try and put an end to this, but mostly the thing, get the ANC out in 2024. And maybe we should all think about what are the most important practical things we can do to make sure that happens. Talking to the political parties is crucial.
I'm Eric Pears. In March 2020, the government achieved totalitarian control over the country, together with total mobilization of the defense force, to very little opposition, or in fact none at all.
Yeah.
They even managed to bypass Parliament through the Disaster Management Act. Firstly, do you think this has emboldened them? And secondly, is there a possibility, having done it once to no opposition, they might decide that let's not have a slow countdown, but let's just do it all at once?
The COVID lockdown was obviously an extraordinary assumption of power, and it was facilitated by fear, which was quite a deliberate strategy. And of course, it was aided by the fact that these terrifying images had come out of China and then out of Italy. And then when Britain tried to say, well, maybe we should just let the virus run and people will get herd immunity and that could be the best approach, outrage from many in the media at letting people die. So the government finding that they also were going to go the lockdown route. And here I'm sure it was really manna to the ANC that you could lock down the entire country, that you could assume these powers, that you could not worry about parliamentary meetings and so on. And you could do it under the Disaster Management Act, which was clearly not designed for such a prolonged stoppage and total stoppage. If anything, there should have been a declaration of emergency with the safeguards under the Constitution that then apply. And various entities then try to go to court to say we shouldn't be using the Disaster Management Act, and we judges on the whole just nodded it through, though there were certain gains that were made in some spheres. But I think people have maybe also learned a bit from the COVID-19 lockdown. All that terror that was created, it was very effective, but at the end of the day, 95% of the population had COVID, and yet the death toll was not that high. I haven't seen final figures on the infection fatality rate, but I expect it's not unprecedented with other bad flus at other times. So perhaps people have learned. You don't surrender your autonomy. You don't go with the fear. You think more about how you can resist and do it more quickly, more determinedly, and right away, I hope.
Well, thank you very much, Anthea, and also to our audience for those very probing questions. I just wanted to extend a special thanks to you, Anthea, for the work that you have done, not only on this book, but on the many other books and periodicals and articles that you've written. The slogan of the IRR is the battle of ideas, one of the slogans. I think you really embody that. But you can only wage the battle with the right ammunition. And that ammunition is research, of which the Institute has a very proud and long tradition going all the way back to 1929 when it was founded. I think it's possibly the oldest classical liberal think tank in the world. And I think this book really embodies the spirit of the Institute. And like my colleague Martin, I'm very proud to have once worked at the Institute and to have been privy to some of your insights. And I also just wanted to echo your comment that the battle of ideas takes resources as well, and that the work of these very active and engaged civil society organizations, that does require funding. And I think these organizations do a lot with a little. And we would implore people who attend our events and who support our work, who read our material on platforms like the Daily Friend, to really support us financially as well, because that will really strengthen our fight for freedom in South Africa. And it's certainly a fight worth having, and there's a lot to preserve in South Africa still. So I just wanted to extend a very warm thanks on behalf of the Free Market Foundation to you. We have a present over here for you, hidden somewhere, like an Easter egg. Some chocolates. But yeah, not to be eaten all at once. Please, just a reminder to everyone here and to everyone listening at home that our next event is actually going to be at the end of August, on the 30th of August, and it will not be hosted here. It will be hosted at another venue, Northwoods in Parktown. So we're very much looking forward to that. But if you come to the FMF offices in Bryanston on the 30th of August, you will be deeply disappointed because we will not be here. So forewarned is forearmed, as Anthea said. And yeah, we're looking forward to that. Please do join us for wine and snacks where we can continue the conversation. And I'm also delighted that the good people from Exclusive Books are here with their credit card machine ready to go to sell you copies of the book. I'm almost finished reading it, and it is truly excellent. And Anthea has very kindly also offered to sign copies of the book should you wish. So please do join me in thanking Anthea for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.